Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal.
Lehman Brothers is going bankrupt, and financial markets from Asia to Europe are doing their utmost to prevent Monday from turning from dark to black. Employees of America's fourth largest investment bank saw the writing on the wall late Sunday after talks to pull them back from the abyss collapsed. British firm Barclays Bank said no thanks, while Bank of America decided instead to help another struggling bank, Merrill Lynch, in a merger deal worth over $50 billion. The U.S. government said it won't bail out Lehman, which last week announced more than $3.9 billion in losses. Shares in Lehman Brothers have plummeted more than 80% in 2008 alone.
All right, everyone. Today we kick off part 2 of our 4-part series on our journey to starting a company, what we learned over the last 18 years on how to grow, survive recessions, pandemics, personal tragedy, and why we still love it. Most days. Good morning, Dee. Are you ready to talk about the darkest days of our economy and Metric Lab?
Yeah, I had to kind of refresh my memory a little bit because I think I blocked out quite a bit of it, just kind of thinking about like, oh, what were we doing? What happened? All that kind of things. It's one of those things where it's like, all right, well, we went through it. Now it's time to put it behind us and move on. But there's certainly some lessons to be learned.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I listened to that clip and it just reminds me of all of us sitting there, looking at the news going like, what is happening? Right. Because we weren't obviously tracking it so closely that we knew what was going on with every bank and stuff. There were some warning shots that were made, but you never really think that a global deep recession, almost a depression, would occur. And that occurred in 2008. And that is basically where we left off from our part 1 series, and that was the
Yeah.
financial collapse and kind of what it did to us. So I want to start by just asking you, what do you remember about that week, that month? Like, what was run through your mind? What were you thinking? Where were you at
Yeah.
the time?
Well, what I remember most actually is the fact that you predicted it like a year ahead of time. Like, I don't think you didn't predict the level of scope that it got to, but you had said, hey, this thing is coming. It's going to be bad. We're looking for, when the government steps in, because that's the thing. Like, there was definitely something building and it had been
Yeah.
in the air for a little while. I think a lot of people were in denial. Like the signs were there. Like you watch The Big Short, you know that you it's clear that the signs were there, but so many people were just in denial of what was going on.
hmm
And then you had a lot of just individuals out there who had no idea what was going on because they just got the message that everything was going great.
Yeah, the thing about The Big Short, that movie, I mean, it almost brings me chills. I've watched it 3 times. I still go back and
Yeah.
watch it because what ultimately happened was the bankers, the kind of main characters, I should say, in the movie. You have to watch it; it's very complicated. But they actually went and did user experience research. They
Yes. I remember
actually,
I
yeah,
actually tell people like if you want to kind of see what we do, go watch that movie and pay attention to what Steve Carell's character is doing when he goes down to
mhm,
Florida and he's interviewing people as far as like what is actually happening on the ground. And then bringing it back to all these people who are, at their home locations in Wall Street and other financial locations around the country who have their assumptions about what's going on.
mhm.
And he's coming in and telling them like that, what you assume is not what's actually happening.
Yeah. I remember at that time, it was about maybe 3 months before the collapse happened. I was, we were thinking about my wife and I, well, we weren't married at the time, but we were together and we were talking about what it takes to buy a house and that kind of stuff. And we were kind of looking into it a little bit because, we're trying to save and it takes years and years to kind of prepare for it. And I remember looking at like what I qualified for and I was like, oh, okay. And then someone was telling me like, oh, there's just these types of mortgages you can get where like they won't even look at your income and you can get like up to $700,000 and all this kind of, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like my brain
Yeah.
was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like if you don't have the money to pay for it, I don't understand how they can not even look at your income. And I
Yeah.
remember thinking that this was like weird because like we'd heard about a couple where they collectively together made very little money, but qualified for a $750,000 house that they bought. And then ultimately after this collapse, they lost it. And
Yeah.
I remember at the time just thinking it was weird. I feel like in your mind, like if this is just a side note, but if there's like weird little bells going off about something that's
Hmm.
occurring, whether it's in the economy or at work or something like that, you kind of have to investigate it because there's probably something to it, right? I remember feeling like that's weird. And it's like if
Yeah,
your brain goes that's weird, I think that means that you need to look into it.
yeah. I remember the first time I heard about a variable rate mortgage, and my immediate response was just that seems like an incredibly terrible idea. Like nobody should ever sign up for that. That seems predatory. And what do you know?
Yeah.
It was.
Well, do you want me to tell you? I'll make a prediction right now while we're on the podcast. Something that has
Hmm.
been ringing bells in my ears for years now, which is these micropayments that everybody lets you make. Like pretty much anything you buy online now says, "Oh, break it up into 4 easy payments. Break it up into eight
Hmm.
payments. Pay $20 each month for the next 2 years." And the fact that you could do it so easily and frequently worries me. I feel
Yeah.
like I shouldn't be breaking apart a t-shirt that I'm buying from Vans in addition to 50 other things that I am researching or wanting to buy online. And so I do have a little bit of a concern around that, and it seems a little creepy. It's helpful for lots of things, like especially medical bills and all these other things that are necessary.
Sure.
But when you're like, oh, I really want that new jacket that costs $200, well, if you can't afford a $200 jacket, maybe you shouldn't break it up into 8 payments. That's just kind of my thinking around it, especially coming out of the 2008 collapse. Like
Yeah,
people
I've
were,
definitely used that for a
sure,
few
yeah, me too.
things,
Yeah.
and it's worked out, and it makes sense at times. It is a little alarming when it's like, oh, hey, I'm buying like a $20 thing, and they're just like, oh, hey, you can pay for this for zero interest over the next 8 months, and I'm like,
Yes.
I'm paying $2 a month. What's the point?
Yeah.
And my question tends to be like, all right, well, what is the business model here? How are these companies turning a profit? And I think one of the things is, and we could talk about this at some point because this is one of the ways in which I think Silicon Valley has changed, where they're not necessarily looking to turn a profit. Sometimes they're looking to get some revenue and build a user base, and then exit and make fixing the business model the next person's problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. That is not uncommon,
Yeah,
and that is a whole podcast in its own. But let's circle
yeah.
back a little bit here to that time. So during that time, right before that, we were kind of on fire. We were actually doing quite well. We had started the business in 2006. We landed a couple of fun government related contracts, and I believe we had landed our first or second design firm that reached out to us. And you and
Hmm.
I were kind of figuring things out, and we had not figured it out in the way that we do now, where we use different tools like LinkedIn and that kind of stuff in order to reach our customers and say hello and tell them what we're up to and that kind of stuff. It was mostly word of mouth because a lot of the friends that we had gone to school with were getting jobs at different companies, and they were like, "Hey, we need you. Can you come in?" And you and I would always say, "We will, but can you hire our
Yeah.
company?" Right? um,
Yeah, within that context, yeah, we had kind of that government contract where we were working on medical vehicles and stuff. And at the same time, we were working with Microsoft. We were had a bunch of relationships with eBay.
No, not yet.
Uh,
Microsoft. I don't think we had Microsoft yet, unless I'm
no,
messing up my timeline.
Microsoft. We had some relationships with Microsoft before that. We were working on TV products
Okay.
at the time, and it kept going. So we worked with Microsoft after the I almost said pandemic,
The
after
collapse.
the Great Recession. Also, we're like, oh yeah, we got two of these in our history. Uh, yeah, but Microsoft started before that. I remember going
Okay.
in and working with some of the people and on kind of like that the media room products and things like that. I think we might have done the driving stuff before also. I'm not remembering
No,
perfectly, but
we actually didn't do that, and I'll explain that a little later
yeah.
in this podcast. That was actually after we had got our first nice office, which I'll explain
Oh,
how that
that's
how that
right.
worked
Yeah,
out.
that's right. That's right.
Um,
But
but
yeah, we were
yeah, we were
growing.
humming.
We were doing well.
Yeah, we were humming, and it was making us feel really good about what was going on, and the collapse had nothing to do with the work we do. It had nothing to do with other people's work that they were doing. This was a housing collapse that turned into a major financial collapse. And what this actually did was this made companies say, oh, wait a minute, we need to pause for a second. We don't know what's going on in the economy. So we probably shouldn't spend any money. And that's kind of what was going on. So we realized right after the collapse happened that we were going to be in a little bit of trouble because it's easy. So here's the thing about the work we do as a vendor or consultant or contractor, whatever term you want to use, partner, is that those are the contracts that, yes, they sometimes are bigger financially, but they're also easy to cut because you could just simply say, hey, we need to cut this contract because of, financial reasons or whatever it is. And then they just end the contract. So at that time, we were learning the hard truth basically around the word moratorium. We
Yeah.
had gotten an email from, I believe it was Microsoft, one of our partners at the time, and they said, hey, we have a moratorium on spending with vendors right now. So we'll just let you know when the moratorium opens up and then we could talk again. And that's kind of one of those scary emails where you go, this could be years. This could
Yeah.
be years. It could be months. We have no idea. And I believe we were smart enough at the time to sit there and go, it will come back, even though it was super scary and everyone was freaking out. We did say it will come back in time, but what are we going to do right now? And thankfully, we built this business lean. We built this business with the idea that like we were going to live with friends, we were going to not have any expenses, we were going to keep everything really tight, and then we were going to try to pile money into our business accounts as much as we possibly could so that we created more comfort so we can be a little more aggressive over time and stuff like that. Well, that kind of paid off because it bought us time. And I remember the one thing that we did, and it really helped us, Dee, is that we reached out to a friend of ours who we had worked with in the past, who was living in Paris, and she was is this amazing designer. And I just highly respected the way that she thought, and I just wrote her this long email. It was like a page long email. No one reads page long emails now. And I basically explained everything that I was scared of and everything that was going on with the business, and we didn't know what to do. And she was so awesome. And she wrote back and she kind of explained, here's what you need to do. You need to do what's called a rebrand. This is your opportunity to start over and really tell the story about what you do, why you do it, how you do it. And it really gave us basically an initiative or something to do during this down period that would benefit us greatly in the long run. Do you remember that?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember us doing all of the kind of work to figure out what is that brand going to be, what is our name going to be. We had some other friends who experienced in that area who came in and helped like just give us a process, and we made that our project throughout the downturn.
Yeah, and I remember it being very hard because it was like Mark Cuban was on a podcast the other day, and one of the things he said is that he said I find that most companies that I work with, because he works with like hundreds of companies, obviously a year, he
Hmm.
said is that they create great products, but they don't know what business they're in. And the guy said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, for example, the Mavs." He's like, "We're not in the basketball business. We're in the hey, come and have fun and entertainment business." He said, "Cost plus drugs is not in the business of delivering drugs. We're in the business of basically trust." Like we want people to know they can trust us. And what I realized through you, because you're the one that figured this out, which was yes, we're offering user experience research and storytelling and all that kind of stuff to help you figure out your product, but we're actually in the business of risk mitigation. That's what you said.
Yes.
You said, we're just reducing your risk by working with us and having data behind your decisions. You're just reducing risk. And I remember thinking like, oh, so now I know what business we're in. And we use that as a tool when we were trying to figure out our name and rebrand. And we did a podcast on naming. It's awful. So thankfully, Dee came up with the name for our company. But the thing is that the rebrand was all about figuring out who we're going to be for the next 5 years after this. I almost said pandemic. After this Great Recession.
Yeah.
What do you remember about the process of rebranding, like the actual like head down work?
Well, a lot of it was figuring out like how you want your brand to feel to people. I mean, there's definitely the value proposition. I think the risk mitigation became part of that. The cost savings is a huge deal. Of like, oh, hey, imagine if you got to this certain point and you realized you had to redevelop your platform. Now, imagine I had a tool for you that allow you to do that redevelopment, and you could recoup all of the time and development original development costs and all those things. That's what that's what you get when you discover your problems early, when you can
Mhm.
figure out what changes you need to make before you spend a single engineering dollar. So that's basically the value proposition. That is us kind of like providing decision makers with information so they can make the best decisions possible.
Being able to explain that to me was like the challenge. Like it made sense like when we say it out loud, but explaining it on a website, explaining it in an email, explaining it, it's like that's where the real work came in. And I remember our
Yeah.
friend, another one of our friends, he probably doesn't mind if I say his name, Adam. But Adam had told me, he's like, sometimes we roll up our sleeves and we do head down work. And sometimes we do head up work. Head up work is we're working with our clients and we're helping them solve their problems. And sometimes we spend a lot of
Mhm.
time rolling our sleeves up and working on our own business.
Yeah.
And that's where you
I
guys
think a
are.
very important thing that came out of this, and we kind of, Adam definitely helped us out with this, was we knew what our value proposition was, but that's not enough to be a brand. Like we needed to communicate to people, what does it feel like to have this delivered to you? And
Mm.
part of that was just making it feel as easy, as effortless, as painless as it could possibly be. Just call us up, let us know what's going on. We tell you kind of like a a plan for moving forward, and you just pull the trigger and say go, and we take care of it for you.
Yeah,
And I think that was a very important part of our brand.
when we first started, we used to like when we would deliver like a quote to our client or whatever it is, we like itemized it down to like every little thing that we did. And one of the pieces of advice we got was don't do that because the client doesn't
Yeah,
care about all those details. You might have 1 in 20 that cares about those details. And that one maybe is not a good one to work with because that means they might not have the money essentially to work with you. But the main thing that you want to do is you want to say, here's what we're going to deliver from beginning to end. You have nothing you need to do. You can engage as much as you want, and we will take care of everything. And here's what we're offering. Here's our cost. When you start breaking something down into little bits and pieces, you're kind of ruining your brand in a way. You're kind of making it an a la carte business, and that doesn't really work very well. And we learned that we need to move from a la carte, which is kind of the early thinking, to we are a brand and we are a firm, and you need something done, and we're going to achieve it, and we'll tell you how to do that, and
yeah,
we'll work with you on that. But that was part of the rebranding as well, like understanding who you really are and what you're delivering. Um,
yeah. And one of the things I'll point out also is the part of the process for us figuring out kind of that feel of like that everything's going to be all right, kind of brand perception. We went and talked to a bunch of our friends who had gotten us contracts, a bunch of other people who we worked with, and asked them, why do you guys come to us? What is it that brings you to us? And a lot of what we got back was, I know if I come to you, it's going to get done well. I'm not going to have to micromanage it. I'm not going to have to worry. I'm not going to have to check in. I can just set it and forget it and move on to other things. And that was a huge value to them.
Absolutely. And that should be a huge value to anyone listening who's building a business is
Yes.
you have to make people feel like they don't the whole point of them of a company hiring you is so they don't have to do it. So if they feel like they have to pretty much do it with you the whole way because they don't trust you, well, they're not going to hire you again. They're also not going to refer you. And to your point, you keep saying our friends, our friends. You know, in most schools, colleges, you'll hear a professor at some point say, look to the left, look to the right. Like these are the people you'll be working with or working for in the future. It is so 100% true. Like if you're a good person and you work really hard in school and you make a lot of friends, you're going to have a lot of opportunities when you're older because of the fact that you're connected with people and they already trust your work. That happened with us. I mean, we reached out to everyone we know who worked in our area and they were doing it differently and they were probably curious, why would you guys start a business instead of just coming and working for these different companies and stuff. But you and I just had a feeling that we wanted to do this on our own and build a brand and that kind of stuff, which was painfully difficult. But at the same time, it creates a lot of gratitude, or
Yeah.
not gratitude, but like, like feelings of, I don't know, just you wake up in the morning and go, like, I'm glad I did it. Like, I'm glad I tried,
Yeah.
you
And the
know?
other side of that is the people that you meet, not just in school, but just through the process. You work at our first contract with eBay or Microsoft, I should say, we met some people that later on that became our friends, and then they went to Google and they brought us into Google and so on and so forth. And they did that because both they we connected on a bit of a personal level and developed them as a friend as well as a colleague. And they also knew that we did great work. So between those two, we became their go-to, and it just continued to expand our network because they would introduce us to other people. That person would then leave, for example, Microsoft and go to Samsung, and now we had the person who wanted to bring us into Samsung, and that's kind of how things kind of evolved over time.
Absolutely, yeah. And the one thing I would also say is that we learned. You know, everybody talks about the negatives of the financial collapse, and there were a lot of negatives. Trust me. Um, but there were a few positives that kind of came out of that, and it was something Dina kind of already did, but we learned even deeper, which was like when you're building a business. I feel like there's this weird perception that exists in the world that like you have to have this amazing office and they'll wear the best clothes and people are going to show up and you're going to woo them and also it's like something you see on TV from like a New York law firm or something. That's not the case. I mean, we had clients who literally came to our house and sat next to us in front of our computers when we didn't have an office. I mean, that's
Yeah.
crazy. And they kept hiring us to do work um, because they wanted to work with us. They weren't necessarily trying to work with my office space. So be lean, keep things cheap until you don't have to anymore, right? And
Yeah.
that's just kind of what we did. Now, one of the things I'll say as a side note that how I knew that this recession was probably going to take some time to come out of it was I was living in an apartment at the time. So Demetrius and I were all living together. And then eventually my wife and I moved out, and then Demetrius moved out, and we kind of disbanded after I think it was about a year and a half or 2 years, right? And that was during the
Yeah.
time in which we were saving as much as we can, all that kind of good stuff. I was living in an apartment, and out of the blue, I get a call from the apartment, and they're like, "We're going to lower your rent." Okay, this never happens in Silicon Valley, right? They were just
No.
like, we just want to let you know we're very happy that you're here, and we're going to lower your rent." And I was like, okay, we're in trouble. Like this is going to go on for a long time because real estate companies, like big firms that own like apartment complexes and things like that, they have economists that do projections. They have people in Washington. They know what's going on. They know how long it's to take for things to recover. And so they were looking at this as a long haul thing. So I remember at the time saying, okay, well, this is not the time to necessarily overspend, but this might be a great opportunity in order to get ourselves an office once we land our next big contract and then lock in the rate of that office. Um,
Hmm.
so that when we do come out of this, we have something that is cheap for a while. So it's kind of like a longer term strategy. But we didn't want to do it until we had landed a bigger contract, and that's essentially what happened. We had no other option but to make this business work because it's not like any companies were hiring or anything like that. But a friend of ours, very good friend of ours that we still work with and talk to today, um, he had reached out to us and said, "Hey, I'm working on this bigger government contract, which we're familiar with, and it's going to last for a couple of years, and like I really need you guys' help." And so we really put a lot of our time and effort into trying to like mold and figure out that contract so that once it closed, we knew that we would probably be okay through the recession and move through it. And we put our efforts into that instead of trying to get more clients, new clients. We just wanted to close this one thing. I mean, I remember, I remember having so many conversations with him about it, like weeks and weeks and weeks before we even were able to like sign anything and be part of it. And I was just like finger crossing that we were going to close it because, I didn't know what that next 18 months were going to look like. And this would help us kind of move through it. Do you remember that time?
Yeah, I feel like it's always great within your business if you can have some opportunity to work with government because in these downturns they tend to still keep spending money. In fact,
Yes.
they sometimes will ramp up their spending because they're trying to boost the economy. So it's one of those things. I think we could say who this was with, right? what this
What
contract
you mean
was?
the contract? Oh, yeah, the contract was working with the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. But I just don't want to
Yeah.
mention everybody's name because I don't know if they want to be on the podcast. But it was through that contract, and that contract really was
Hmm.
a saving grace for us.
Yeah. So we were working on air traffic control systems and updating them through the FAA, and NASA was involved too. But it was the kind of thing where, like, okay, all of these private companies are tightening their belts, and they are um, and they're just writing things out. But these government contracts are looking to spend, so which is kind of smart. When things are cheap, that's when you should spend.
Hmm.
So that when we landed that, we're like, okay, great. This is not going anywhere. This is a long-term project. This is like a multi-billion-dollar project, and they're trying to do big things. And that became kind of our like arc through the flood that was going on at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I am so thankful for our friends and the fact that they like came through and like really were like keeping their eyes open for us. Everyone was really looking after one another during that time. I mean, I remember trying to help people get jobs. Like there'd be like one job opening somewhere, and like a bunch of people I knew applying for it, and like trying to like get information about it and help them. And just it was just a nutty time. I mean, I had some friends that didn't even feel it at all. Like they were engineers and they just went to work every day like nothing,
Yeah,
because the companies weren't going to go out of business, but people who worked in areas of like research and innovation and all those spaces, they cut all that temporarily because they
yeah.
just didn't want to spend the money on that. They wanted to spend the money on a core product.
You know what? One of the things I remember is we were looking for alternative avenues of just getting some income in order to
Uh-huh.
survive. And we had the conversation. We had lots of conversations, and I was like, I don't really want to do that. It feels like it's just taken away from kind of our focus on our future. But it got to the point where I actually got approved to be a substitute teacher. Do you remember this?
No.
Yeah, we talked about this. Actually, I got the idea from your sister. She mentioned it to me.
Yeah.
I was like, oh yeah, you sign up, you go through this approval process. You can be a substitute teacher. They'll call you when they have openings, and you can say yes or no. It was kind of like a gig economy thing before the gig economy existed. So I
Mm.
was like, all right, well, this could be a thing. This could be helpful. So I went through the whole thing, got approved, and then we landed that contract. We didn't need it. So I not one time did I ever act as a substitute teacher, but for like a brief moment in time, I was approved to do so.
That's funny. I kind of remember that a little bit. I remember, yeah, thinking like we have to have some backups. Like you and I are pretty
Mhm.
pretty good about that. We're always thinking about 3 steps ahead. But one thing I do remember about that time is you did say to me, as I look for other opportunities, just in case we don't land something in the next 12 months. And you never, ever, ever said like, "Oh, we're getting rid of the business." It was just like, "What do we need to do just to pull through this global recession?" Right? And I remember you saying, "I look at what this thing is willing to pay me, and it's like I'd rather spend 3 hours rebranding and trying to reach out to clients and talking to them than do this thing because it's going to pull me away from the business."
Yeah,
And so unless it was a big financial opportunity, it didn't make sense when it came to what we were
yeah,
trying to do. I mean, it's really hard to explain this to people who didn't go through this, because going through a mild recession is normal. Like that happens. Things go up and
hmm,
down. You might not have a contract for, 3 months or something. Or you maybe have a contract and by the time it ends, the recession's over, right? But this was way different. This was like you call companies and they're like, "Yeah, we can't spend a penny." And you're like, "Why?" And they're like, "'Cause no one knows what's happening." Right? It was a very creepy time where we had to be mentally strong and we had to buckle down and just realize that this was going to be a lean couple of years, you know?
yeah. For context, one of the things that was going on, I just remember that we probably might have some listeners who were like not in the workforce in 2008. But one of the things that was happening at the time was that the banks weren't providing credit to
Yes.
corporations, and the corporations don't just sit on cash, right? They usually they do something with their cash, whether they're kind of like they're buying treasury bills, or maybe they're investing in something. Who knows? But they usually don't sit on the cash. They don't usually have the payroll sitting around. They usually make that happen through credit through the banks, who cover their payroll, and then they pay the banks back. They have like this line of credit. So the banks stopped offering that. So the corporations from Google to Microsoft to Apple on down didn't know if they were going to have the cash flow to
Yep.
pay their people. So it
Yep.
became like, even if they wanted a contract, maybe if they needed it, they didn't know if they had access to the cash, which they definitely had. Like, it's not like Apple and Google and Microsoft were like, oh, hey, I don't have the money. It's just getting access to it and having the liquidity available. So that was a major thing, and that's one of the reasons why everybody was worried about deflation at the time, because credit was exiting the market and all these kinds of things. Uh, that is kind of, we have very, very rarely seen. It's usually inflation is an issue, like we've seen more recently, but deflation was a huge concern at the time, and it meant that, like, they had the money, but it was locked up and they couldn't get to it.
Yeah, and that was really strange too because I hadn't experienced that before. I mean, I was part of the
Mhm.
recession of like what was that 2004 or 5 there was like a mild
Yeah,
recession
the
and
dot-com bust.
yeah, right? And you kind of got used to that. I've just pushed through that kind of quickly. And it wasn't too bad, but this was much different. So things started to get a little bit better, obviously over time. And I think it was around 2009 when we decided to lock down that office that we got that we loved so much.
Mhm.
So what happened and I remember you telling me you didn't agree with me at the time, which is totally fine. You're like, I don't think we need it. But there was a part of me that was like, well, if we can get a really pretty nice office for like bargain basement pricing.
Yeah,
um, could we start wooing clients to come and visit us there? Could we do our research there? Can we get it out of the house and be more separate? Because we had like a smaller one office that we rented that had like no windows for testing, and it was depressing, and we rarely used it. So I remember looking at it and said like, "Hey, I'm gonna go take a look at this thing." Drove down to Redwood City to look at it because we were living in San Jose at the time, and it was gorgeous. It was beautiful, and I remember the person who was renting it said something you cannot get these days. Is they said, "We will give you this price." I forgot what it was, but it was really cheap.
mhm,
And but with a 3-year contract, and I said, I have this agreement with my business partner that everything has to be year to year. That way, if either one of us want to leave the business, then we don't have the burden of the thing. And they said, okay, well, we'll keep the price the same, but you can bail at the end of every year if you need to. And I was like,
yep,
great. So they said that was awesome. And I walked out. It was on the water, which was really neat. And I walked out on the water, and there was a couple people out there eating lunch. And this woman was sitting on a park bench. And I walked up to her and I said, "Hey, do you have an office here?" And she's like, "Oh, hi, yeah, I do have an office here." And I said, "I was thinking about renting out this office right over here. What do you think?" And she said, "You would have to pry me out of my office to make me leave. That's how much I love this place." And I was like, "Huh?" So I did a little user research and I was like, "Huh? Okay." And I was like, "What do you love about it?" She's like, "Look around." And we were like on the boat docks and near the water, and it was quiet and there were ducks and it was beautiful. And I was like, "Okay, well, thanks for the feedback." And she's like, "And the owners are really nice and they're super helpful." And I was like, "Great." So I came back and I told you about it, and you were like, "All right, you think it'll work?" And I was like, "I think it'll help." And in the beginning, it was just you and I sitting there, but eventually over time, right? Clients started visiting us there, and they were like, "Oh, we love to come visit you because it's like we get a break from work and we can kind of relax by the water, and we would get our lunches and hang out there." And it was a very fun time when we had that office, which we didn't close until the pandemic hit, and there was no point of going anymore. But
yeah,
we've had it for all those years. But to me, that was like a big pivotal point because we're testing in the office. We're having users come to our office and do testing. We didn't have to rent a facility or go to the client's site. We would take it away from the client, and the client loved it because it separated their product their name and their brand from the thing that was being tested. So you get an
yeah.
unbiased response from your user. And it was great. And I feel like it was a nice little launching point coming out of such a nasty recession.
Yeah, and there were a lot of really good logistical things about that location. It was right off the freeway. It had plenty of parking. We had a nice private space where nobody would bother us, and we didn't have to worry about any kind of data security or anything like that. So people could come in as participants and park very easily, find us very easily, do this study, and then be on their way. The only kind of downside was it wasn't very close to any meaningful public transportation, but
Yeah.
that didn't come up very often for us. At the end of the day, I think the fact that we got that government contract when we did set us up to act on things like this while there was still an opportunity to get in for cheap.
Uh-huh.
And that was a huge benefit to us.
It was a huge benefit. We saved so much. I mean, that office now would be 3 times what we paid for it.
Yeah,
And
we bought quite a few things in that time period because it was because we can get things for cheap. And once we started getting, we were only without a contract for 5 months. That's the longest we've gone without a contract. And
yeah,
because everything was a moratorium, it was a huge thing. But at the same time, we hadn't yet gotten to the point where we had the backups where we would want it to be. And so when I tell people nowadays that they're thinking about starting a business, I tell them make sure to have at least a year's worth of your payroll in an account ready to sustain you, because you never know how long these things are going to go, and you don't want to get to the point of desperation where you're now making bad decisions. You want to make sure that you're set up properly.
absolutely. Like that's one of the biggest things I learned from that, is a lot of companies do overspend, especially startups that are being funded by venture capital and stuff like that. We weren't funded by anything. I mean, we were funding from our clients, right? They'd pay us. We would take the way we did this was we'd basically just take a percentage of everything that we made every single month from our clients. And that would go into kind of a backup fund to protect us from these types of events. And then a percentage of that would also go into future investments of the company. And then the rest of it, we would figure out how to pay ourselves out accordingly and that kind of stuff. And we really looked at it from the perspective of like, well, I should only be spending what we have. Like, it doesn't make any sense to borrow a tremendous amount of money in order just to get an office. No, we got the
Yeah,
office because we started getting contracts again. Things started
yeah.
to really advance and move forward. And that's where things got really, really interesting. So I don't know if you remember this, but after that government contract, we landed Google and we started working with them on some really fun stuff. And the Google started this ball rolling down the hill, and we landed this through a friend. Our friend got the contract at GoPro and then brought us in, and we
Hmm.
had this amazing time working with him on so much fun on GoPro cameras and things like that. And that started the ball rolling down the hill of working with Samsung and all these other groups. But what actually happened organically is we started becoming the research team that was very, very trusted. And because of that, we got moved into these innovation groups. And, we
Hmm.
can't ever talk about the work that we did within the innovation groups, but these are the groups that are thinking 3 to 5 years out. They've got sketches or prototypes of really innovative things. And so we got to do that with a lot of these clients and really see how they think. And they got to see how we think and how we can use forward thinking data in order to determine if a product's gonna work well in the market, or if it's gonna reside in a silo that no one's gonna want, whatever that is. Like, we learned how to work within those groups, and that became like our thing for like 5 years. We worked on
Yeah.
so many innovation projects for like 5 years, and it's really fun and exciting. But that's kind of what happens post recessions, right? No one spends any money, and then they realize, oh no, we better start innovating again because our company's going to fall behind, right?
Yeah, we kind of see that now. I think with basically what's going on in Hollywood was that through the pandemic, they weren't able to develop very much. They weren't able to work, so everything kind of fell behind. Their content, like the content that's coming out this year in movies, we talked about why there's this trend recently of these big movies not doing very well. I mean, that was leading up to the Barbenheimer thing. Um, but I think it was because they couldn't work and develop during that time period, and now they're getting it again with the strikes that are going on. But that was what was going on back then, when a lot of these tech companies and the startup community were just like on life support for
Hmm.
a while, and that it took them a while to kind of come out of it and recover and get back to the point where they were creating new product, and that's kind of precipitated a little bit of a spending spree.
Oh, absolutely. It makes total sense that you would have a spending spree because during the recession, people always remind me of this. They go, "That's where Airbnb came from. That's where all these big, huge, massive companies you see now, they
Probably
come."
Uber, Instagram,
That was
yeah.
right. Uber, Instagram, what is it? Pinterest, all those
Yep.
things came from that time. And the reason why it came was because the big companies weren't spending anything and weren't innovating. And then entrepreneurs came in and said, hey, people need to save money. Maybe they should rent out their rooms, Airbnb. Oh, people want to figure out, how to design cheaply in their house. They'll go on this thing called Pinterest, right? And they started creating these opportunities that allowed people to kind of feel like they're still engaging and doing things during that time. But then when the money came back and the floodgates opened, these companies became billion-dollar companies because it stuck while people were on it during the recession, and then it continued even to this day. So we had the opportunity to work with some of these companies and engage with them and see what they're doing, and it was an exciting and fun time. One other thing about the office I wanted to point out was that we picked an office that had a very easy parking lot. And that became a huge benefit because we were doing some hardware testing, things like, maps in cars and all that fun stuff. And that required us to wire up our vehicles and do interesting things. And if you get an office in a location that's like in a downtown and there's no parking anywhere, you can't, as a researcher, you can't really do any of that. So
Oh yeah.
it was a huge benefit that we didn't realize we were going to need until we had it.
Yeah, we have some clients that are who are when we go visit them, it's in these offices in like financial district San Francisco, and it's always becomes this huge pain because there's no parking there. It's not easy to get in and out of, even if you're taking public transportation. It's like a huge time suck. So it ends up being a challenge. And if you're building a business and you're making it difficult for your clients to come visit you, because of location you're picking, then you're kind of putting yourself in a bad position, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah. And this is kind of where I think we should leave off because the next phase of this was the mobile boom. So as we went from 2010 to 2000, you know, 18, 19, everyone can pretty much think about what happened during that time. This was the mobile app boom, right? This is where
Yeah.
the Ubers, the all that stuff kind of came from. And that whole segment has grown up until this point now. And now we're starting to see the AI boom kind of thing. But I think the next phase of this, the part three of this, is that we should talk about what that actually looked like to go from testing big computers and hardware components to suddenly everybody wants an app and everyone wants their app tested and everybody wants everybody on their app. And
Hmm.
what does that actually look like? And what kind of changed during that time? I mean, I will say that during that time, we saw a lot of designers start to reach out to us and say, I got to test this stuff because we're realizing this is a lot different than developing applications for desktop because people look at it and within 1 second, if it doesn't meet their needs or it's weird or it's hard or it's difficult to use, they bail. And this was kind of new for the design community to have to build something that instantly caught your attention and instantly worked. When you look at something like a software, I mean a business service application or something like, I don't know, Intuit or something, right? You're gonna click around and mess around with it. You're gonna play with it and try to get it to work because you need it for your finances or something like that. When it comes to something like booking a night stay, at an Airbnb, it's got to be click, 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 done. It's got to be simple and easy, and that's what this whole 2010 to 2019 became about. Like, how do we build things that are so easy to use that you barely even have to think? All right, well, I think we'll leave off there and we'll circle back in the next couple of weeks and talk about part three and talk about that whole mobile time. And then after that, we'll talk about where we are right now. So everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us. We really appreciate it. As I always mention, please follow us. We're at the X Podcast on YouTube. That's a great place to leave comments or any questions you might have for us. And if there are any other things that you want us to talk or discuss, that's also a great place to reach out to us. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next week.